It's not news that in the film industry, many high-budget movies later fail at the box office because they manage to acquire a considerable sum of their costs, or many cases, they do not even manage to cover them. In this video, we'll highlight movies that failed at their premiere. Make sure you stick with me to the end of the video. Without any further delay, let's get into it. Let's start with Heaven's Gate. This 1980 Western movie has become somewhat of a cult classic, but when it was released, it was a colossal failure that bankrupted its studio United Artists. Written and directed by Michael Cimino, fresh off the success of 1978's The Deer Hunter, Heaven's Gate ruined his reputation and saw the Western genre vanish from cinema for an entire decade. Cimino was blamed for the debacle, with his vision pushing the movie 4 times over the budget. BBC reported that he was 5 days behind schedule, 6 days into filming, and had spent $900,000 on a minute and a half of usable footage. When the movie was finally released, critics said that it was pretentious and meandering. Moviegoers found it long and confusing. Heaven's Gate cost $44 million to make. It had a gross revenue of just $3.5 million worldwide. And the movie's name became a byword for box office failure. The next big budget box office flop is John Carter. John Carter is the perfect example of how a movie with a huge budget can be a massive gamble for studios. The 2012 science fiction fantasy film, based on pulp novels from the early 1900s and starring Taylor Kitsch in the title role, had a staggering production and advertising budget of $350 million and took a $200 million write-down after grossing $284 million at theaters worldwide. Critics noted that because of the budget, John Carter had to generate ticket sales of $600 million to break even. This was quite a stretch and didn't happen. Disney's massive swing from profit to loss in the second fiscal quarter of 2012 was primarily due to John Carter, which led Richard Ross, then head of Walt Disney Studios, to resign. Unfortunately for Disney, this isn't their only appearance on this list. Next up, Cutthroat Island. Carolco Pictures went under after the release of the pirate romantic comedy Cutthroat Island. It wasn't until 2015 that they began production again. The film's infamously chaotic production involved numerous rewrites, recastings, and the departure of 20 crew members. After the chief camera operator was fired, a cameraman injuring his leg, raw sewage leaking into the water tank, and many more mishaps. There was also a scramble to start filming in line with Michael Douglas's schedule, but he later pulled out, and practically every big star at the time declined to replace him until Matthew Modine came along. The original $65 million budget ballooned to $98 million, with director Renny Harlin coughing up $1 million of his own money to drag the production across the finish line. The result was a cliched script, poor acting, and a host of continuity errors. The film pulled just $10 million at the box office, with a marketing budget of about $16 million. Our next big budget box office flop in the list is Cats. Based on the Broadway musical of T.S. Eliot's poetry, 2019's Cats had a lot of challenges to overcome. This stage production was widely seen as a bizarre show with a primarily nonsensical plot, though it was enormously popular. In the play, actors dressed up as cats in elaborate costumes, but the film instead opted to use motion capture CGI, along with a star-studded cast of people like Judi Dench, Idris Elba, and Taylor Swift. This didn't work. On its debut, audiences and critics derided the animation. It had been rushed to meet the release deadline. To try and fix this, Universal Pictures pushed new cuts of the film with redone effects after it had already hit theaters, but the results still looked creepy and off-putting compared to the traditional play. Add all that to a narrative that's impossible to follow, and you'll end up with poor box office performance. Cats ultimately made $75.5 million on a $95 million budget, plus an incredible $115 million in ad spending. Another big budget box office flop is Mulan. Like many other film projects, the live-action remake of the beloved animated movie Mulan was thrown into flux by the rising COVID-19 pandemic. As a film filled to the brim with spectacle and with many sequences filmed on location in China, its $200 million budget wasn't so surprising. But no one could have predicted the COVID-19 pandemic and the effect it would have on the motion picture industry. The picture was initially planned for release in late March 2020, but was postponed as theaters began shutting down. After multiple attempts at rescheduling, Disney settled on pushing Mulan to the Disney Plus streaming service in September 2020, along with release to some theaters in international markets. The film took in just under $70 million at the box office, with over half of that coming from China. The remake failed to live up to the emotional stakes of the original animated animated feature. However, Disney scaled down marketing costs to just $50 million because the film was bound for streaming, while at the same time charging Disney Plus subscribers an additional $30 to see it. These maneuvers no doubt helped recoup some of the losses. What about The 13th Warrior? Based on the Michael Crichton novel Eaters of the Dead and a loose retelling of Beowulf, The 13th Warrior is infamous for its box office bomb. The production budget started at around $85 million, but several reshoots and promotional expenses saw it reach somewhere in the region of $160 million. The film, starring Antonio Banderas, Omar Sharif, and Diane Venora, made just $61.7 million at the box office. In addition to the negative reviews, the picture competed with the hit The Sixth Sense for moviegoer dollars and came up way short. The movie has another claim to fame. It was so bad, it caused Omar Sharif to give up acting for a few years. Bad pictures are very humiliating. I was sick, said Sharif. He added that it was terrifying to have to do the dialogue from bad scripts, to face a director who does not know what he's doing in a film so bad that it isn't even worth exploring. The next big budget box office flop is The Lone Ranger. Following Disney's spectacular flop in 2012 with John Carter, a financial success would be just what the doctor ordered. This is not how 2013's The Lone Ranger worked out, however, struggling to match a production budget of $215 million and a $150 million marketing budget. Critics estimated it would need to earn around $650 million worldwide to break even after accounting for revenue splits with theater owners. Still, it grossed just $260.5 million, causing unfavorable comparisons to John Carter. The Western starred Johnny Depp and Armie Hammer, and it was plagued with production troubles from the get-go. The Lone Ranger competed with Despicable Me 2 at the box office on opening weekend, but Despicable Me 2 made under a third of what The Lone Ranger made, and on a budget more than 3 times larger. Since the previous 1981 Lone Ranger outing had also been a flop, some wondered if the public no longer cared about this TV staple of the 1950s. Next is King Arthur: Legend of the Sword. At some point in his career, director Guy Ritchie pivoted from making gritty crime dramas to schmaltzy adventure flicks. King Arthur is a prime example of a gritty crime drama. Charlie Hunnam starred as Arthur, the young king who pulled the legendary sword from the stone and inherited the throne of Britain. The movie displayed Guy Ritchie's usual flair, with over-the-top action and excessive slow motion, but it didn't woo audiences, probably because they were sick of King Arthur movies. You can hardly count how many Arthurian pictures have been made over the last century. Plenty of them have been more compelling than this modern take. King Arthur earned $148.6 million worldwide against a $297 million budget. Mars Needs Moms big budget box office flop. There have been dozens of successful computer animated comedies in recent times, but Mars Needs Moms is not one of them. The Walt Disney picture had a budget of $150 million plus $50 million for marketing, but grossed just $39 million at the box office, making it one of the most prominent box office flops in history. Some say Mars Needs Moms failed due to the subject matter of the film, a mother being kidnapped by Martians leaving her child alone. Others say the animated humans were too realistic, which most audiences found creepy. Ultimately, the movie became one of the enormous write-downs in modern Hollywood history. Wrapping it up, we have Town and Country. This romantic comedy about two middle-aged couples and their extramarital affairs featured no CGI animation, action sequences, or special effects. Yet, it managed to generate a budget of $90 million thanks to a slew of rewrites and reshoots, ultimately taking 3 years to finish. Anticipating poor performance, New Line Cinema skipped on marketing compared to the total budget and only spent $30 million. It also canceled the film's premiere party. Negative reviews from critics and moviegoers didn't help the box office, which grossed a paltry $10 million. That concludes today's video. If you found the video helpful, please do consider giving us a thumbs up, and don't forget to share the video with your friends and family. See you next time.